Okay, so today it is Jonathan Popowich, Trung Bien, and myself, Ken Rigel, and we are going to be talking about the blanket rezoning, which was just voted in by the city of Calgary. There's a lot of people that have been asking about this. It's a hot topic. It was a marathon session at City Council, but it finally did get voted in earlier this week. Now, Trung, you are more the expert on this stuff than John and I are, so we're probably going to be grilling you with questions on this today. But let's get started. The one thing I want to start with is, okay, so now we've got this blanket rezoning in place. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that actually means, but there was a money component to this too, was there not? Where the city got a certain amount of funding if our blanket rezoning went through. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's
And so
correct. Yeah.
what was that dollar figure? So like and the funding came from the federal government, I think, too.
Federal government, and it was 220 million for an accelerated housing fund. So the
Wow.
more houses you build, the more houses, the more funding you get. And one of the components was that the entire city needed to be rezoned.
So that's to me, that's I don't know about you guys. Doesn't that sound like that's, financial motivation for the council to vote it in and maybe not really think about what's best for the city? And I'm not saying this isn't great for the city. That's not what I'm saying. But when I hear that the federal government is funding this and then council votes it in because could there be a motivation just to get the funding?
For sure, I'd say that it's just almost like a bribe.
Well,
And
that's what it
is
sounds like to me, but I wasn't going to say bribe. I'm glad you did.
and does the federal government know how to run the city better than the local government is the other question, right? And it was kind of an all or none proposal.
Well, and they
So
pulled the
big
plebiscite too,
motivator.
right? Because Calgarians didn't even really get a say on in this unless they wrote into their counselor.
I think the local government would have known if it was a plebiscite, it wouldn't have went through.
Yeah.
I believe there was at least 700 people that went up and spoke and mentioned their thoughts. 80% of them were against it.
Wow. Crazy. All right. So let's talk about what it means. It's passed. So what does it mean now? So John, do you have clients that are asking questions about this? Do you have clients that are interested in it? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there's the clients that are asking about it, kind of wondering what it means, what it's going to do for values. Obviously, there's always been a certain premium given whatever zoning a property may have, and along with size and all that sort of thing. And then the other part of it, so maybe there's going to be a bit of an effect on value for certain properties. Maybe people that paid a premium to have a certain zoning previously, compared to what the blanket zoning has maybe changed things to now. That I think that's kind of one of the questions that I'm getting. And then the other one would be people that have historically bought in specific areas for specific reasons. Take a community like Killarney as an example. Clients that are maybe exiting an infilling community like Killarney to try and get into something that is predominantly an R1 neighborhood where there's a little bit more space, a little bit more parking, more mature neighborhoods.
Larger
Uh,
lot, all that stuff.
totally. Now, just to possibly be facing some of the similar kind of concerns that a community like that has seen. So yeah, it's an interesting time and a little tumultuous out there for sure.
My concerns around something like this is one thing I've always thought is, okay, so let's take Bankview, for example. Bankview is one of those communities that's kind of a mishmash, right? You've got multifamily stuffed in the middle. You can have 5-story rental properties. You can have crack shacks right next door, and then you can have a $3 million property. It's kind of all over the place because Bankview is one of those communities that was absorbed by the city. It was its own municipality years and years and years ago. So it's got this mishmash of zoning, and it's been a really tough neighborhood because of that. Like, my thought, are we in for that? Is that what the future of these R1 neighborhoods is going to look like?
I would disagree with that, mainly because with this RCG zoning, it only allows for low-rise density housing. So they can only be up to a maximum of 2 or 3 stories. And then the entrance to each unit has to be from the ground level. So it should blend like a low density townhouse should blend in with a single family because it should be the same height and the entranceways should be all accessible from the street. Whereas in Bankview, it has apartments where there's an interior stairwell to get to each person's unit. So we will see a blend, but you're not going to see it as congested or as big of a mishmash. It should blend in quite well. And just because it has RCG zoning, it doesn't mean that every single lot is suddenly going to be a townhouse development. It just means that that single family home can now be permitted to have a legalized basement suite, a carriage suite, a duplex, or potentially townhouse development. But
Okay,
all
so
all the entranceways has to be accessible from the street.
from the street. So then when we're talking about a townhouse development with RCG, what is the maximum number of units you could put on, say, a standard 50 by 120 lot?
4 units above grade, 4 units below grade.
Okay, so a total of 8.
Yeah. Yeah, on
Okay,
a
all
standard 50
accessible
by
from the street.
120.
So
All
okay,
have to be
so
accessible from the street. Yeah.
so if it's accessible from the street, that would mean that a staircase, an exterior staircase, could be accessible by the street, right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
So the basement suites have an exterior staircase going down where the front door is accessible from the street.
So then what about, so where does the height restriction come in here? Because you can build a staircase as tall as you want, as long as it's on the outside of the building. You can build a 4-story staircase. You can do that. Is that part of this, or would that be getting around the rules, or do we know that?
From what I know, it should be only maximum 3 stories.
Maximum 3 stories.
Yeah,
So then
maximum
when
3 story.
so if it's RCG, that's contextual, right? That's what the C stands for. Am I correct in that?
I don't think so. I don't know.
Okay.
Now you're throwing me off.
Okay. So
But
then,
the
so
but
let's
the G
throw the word
stands for ground
contextual in
oriented.
there, right?
Yeah.
Like when we're going
Yeah.
for rezoning or we're going to go for a development permit, there are some contextual limitations in every development permit. So say that we're in a neighborhood that is R1s and they've all got bungalows in it. It's a 50s or 60s neighborhood, 50 by 120 lots. And so would the height restriction on those homes come into play? Like if they're all bungalows, are we now going to start seeing low-rise duplexes again? Because remember in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you look in all these neighborhoods, they're all those low-rise style bungalows. Then infills became a thing. Are we going back to those low-rise style bungalows then? Is that what we're looking at? For
If you
duplexes?
have like a street full of bungalows and then there's a development there, they can still do a 3 story, but then the height restriction is a little bit more limited. What compared to if they had a 2 story beside them or a 3 story beside them.
Got
So
it.
they can still do a 3 story. It's a little bit more challenging, but it can still be done. Just keep in mind too, when it comes to these developments, the land use is just one component of the development of the build process. For these communities that are R1, such as Lake Bonavista, Kingsland, if there's any relaxations for that development permit, there's a high likelihood that a neighbor will appeal it, and it's like a $250 application, and they'll probably stop that development. But if the developer does not ask for any relaxations to the development permit, the neighbor can't appeal it.
Right, right.
Right. So you can still expect to see townhouses, but the development cannot ask for any relaxations. And if they do, I would say that it's going to get appealed pretty quick, which is a pretty quick process for the neighbor, like $250 application, and they can stall out the process for quite a long time.
Got it. Got it. So John, in your world up on the hill where you do a lot of business on the hill, you do a lot of business west of town. Any concerns there? Like any thoughts on what might happen up there?
No, not really any concerns. I think the one thing that we are seeing though is we have seen an uptick in interest in moving outside of town or moving into areas where there isn't going to be the same kind of, quote unquote exposure. And maybe it's a little bit, people are a little bit quick to hit the panic button now, but I think there is going to naturally just be a little bit of increased desirability to get out onto the acreage or onto a type of property where it's going to be very difficult to see that kind of infilling coming into those neighborhoods. So we're starting to have some of those conversations from people that are, we're going to be inner city people forever, that are now starting to look a little bit more suburbia.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It'd be interesting to see what happens over the next year. I mean, I think we go through a full calendar year. We should have a very good idea how this is going to play out over the next 4 or 5 years for sure.
Yeah.
So, Trung, just talk to me about the difference between RCG and RGO that because that's the other
HGO.
or HGO, right? So, what's that? What
HGO.
is? I don't even know that stuff. What is the difference between the two when we're using, when we're trying to explain that?
I don't know like the differences too much. However, RCG was typically for corners, and
Okay.
HGO was for mid-block lots.
Yeah.
And HGO was a new land use designation for inner city.
Yeah.
But now with this blanket rezoning, the rezoning is going to be all RCG for inner city, and the newer communities are going to be RG.
Okay.
What the differences entails, I'm not 100% sure. But in terms of what your comment was about, like with the change that we expect to see, I honestly think that the change is going to be pretty slow and gradual at first, and then maybe within 10 years that you'll start seeing more significant changes, and then maybe in 20-30 years, that's when you're going to see a dramatic change. And so I think it's going to be a slow creep. So I don't think a lot of people should be really worried about this, because it's going to be a very gradual change. But 20-30 years from now, I think that's when, if we never made these changes now, you'll see that housing affordability will just be way too out of touch in the city. So I think the planning now is really kind of preparing the future generation the opportunity to afford a house, right? Because if they didn't do this change now, the cost of a single family home, it's just too out of touch for them, especially with how prices are currently. And just imagine what it's going to be 10 years from now. And then with this new product type that can be coming out, it builds a bridge for someone who is a condo owner that can't afford a detached home to kind of buy what they call the missing middle product, so they can kind of upgrade to another home before purchasing that detached house.
Right.
So I think it's for the greater good, and I would say that the real change you will see in 20-30 years from now.
So,
Trung, you think so that missing middle product, that would be sort of that this townhouse potentially that we would see that would be built in there. Of
Yeah.
those, how many do you expect to see as like purpose-built rental style versus like individual titled townhouse type units? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. With the type of financing that's available for projects that are 5 units or more, that allows for a 50-year amortization, attractive interest rates, 95% loan to value. Most of the product that's going to be built is going to be rental.
Right.
So it's actually not going to be for purchase. I'd say for most of these townhouse projects, I would say 9 out of 10 of them, and that's just kind of just a random number, but I don't know anyone who's building these townhouses for sale. Maybe one. Most of them are keeping it for rental.
So back to the whole like affordability crisis. Like I see this as solving housing, getting more houses out there or places to live, but not necessarily owned houses, right? So when we start talking about affordability of single family detached homes, there's going to be less of them. And then just as far as properties to own, if they're all going to be purpose-built rentals, or a big chunk of them are going to be that, it could be just kicking the can down the road a little bit, don't you think, in terms of getting into the
Yeah.
market, so to speak?
For homeownership, yes. But for providing people a roof over their head, it should solve the problem. But in the end, building houses does not happen overnight, especially with the development permit process, the safety code inspections, and then just the resources to even build these houses. So the process would be pretty slow. But you're right, like a lot of these townhouses that are to be built with this type of financing, it's going to be for rental.
Yeah.
which is interesting because most, there's a good chunk of our market. It's like 25 to almost 30% of our market has been investor purchased over the last 5 years. And that has contributed to the increase in value here that we're seeing at an exponential rate. So, if we're putting this much more rental product into the marketplace, it's not going to be long before more than half of the city is owned by investors and by landlords.
I think that's what's interesting, is that we live in kind of like a capitalistic world, and this is the capitalist approach to solving the housing supply. So it is a solution. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's going to be profitable for the people that participate in construction.
Yeah. Interesting. It's a cool topic. I mean, my limited knowledge on it, we've got lots of fear from our clients that are concerned about large towers or like 4-story units going up beside them, or the middle of the block of a stretch of 10 bungalows in a row, that middle block being a fourplex that's tall. We've got a lot of people worried about that. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I just My concern, as always, whenever something like this happens, is the infrastructure in place first for these communities? Like, we do all this stuff before we build out more grocery stores and more shopping and all that kind of stuff in these inner city neighborhoods. Are we just adding more people that's going to overwhelm the resources that we have in these communities? That's a thought I've got.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good thought.
So, anyways, it's interesting. Let's hear your thoughts. If anybody, if you want to chime in on it, send your comments below. We would love to hear from you, and anything you want us to talk about in the future too. We'd be more than happy to take your suggestions on some topics that are really interesting to you, and we can tackle those the next time that we get together. Guys, thanks so much for hanging out today, and I really appreciate your perspective on this.
Right on. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
Pleasure.